you have been sharing so far, and it looks rich and exciting. I'm a relative newcomer to this area, and as I'm going to give you this little presentation here over the next 20 minutes, you'll probably sort of see the evolution of my own thinking on this topic. I think it's an absolutely fascinating area in which really multiple disciplines should and can come together productively. So here is, the organizers assigned me a pretty broad topic, as you heard, CO2 regulations and electricity pricing. I'm going to really just cover a very small sliver of this, namely the one that sort of came out of research that I've been doing over the last couple of years. Was a graduate student who couldn't be here today because she just graduated and took her new job up already. Let me just sort of to set the stage, talk a little bit about, you're all aware, CO2 regulations, either the existing ones or the ones that have been proposed, take a variety of forms. Direct regulations like what the Environmental Protection Agency does or is contemplating on doing, renewable energy portfolio standards, and in certain parts of the world like Europe and coming soon to California as well, also the possibility of a cap and trade system. And of course the question that policymakers have been and business people have been staring at for a long time now is this whole question: if we have alternative regulatory policies inside and corresponding CO2 emission limits, what is this going to do to electricity prices? In particular, what motivated me was a wide range of forecasts that I saw in terms of the impact that, say, the regulations proposed under the Waxman-Markey bill, which is, I guess, still lingering in the House of Representatives, or it has passed the House of Representatives, lingering in Congress. What would that do ultimately in terms of electricity prices and impact on the economy as a whole? No shortage of predictions that say this would go as far as to double electricity prices, which would, of course, be very significant. So question, is there really a basis for that? And that's really where this type of work goes. Here is something that many of you may have seen. The McKinsey cost curve. Has this come up here in the discussion so far? Okay, well then I will be really brief on this. I have stared at that curve for a long time. I cannot quite figure it out in terms of A, how McKinsey got there, or more importantly, really how to interpret it. In particular, is it reasonable to say that if we had pricing of CO2 emissions at a certain level, say $30 to $60, that we would get the corresponding amounts of CO2 abatement? I think if you read the report carefully by McKinsey, they're sort of hedging and saying we're trying to measure it at to some extent social cost without really being in a position to predict whether certain parties have the incentives to take the measures that would result in the reduction of CO2 emissions. So they're hedging somewhat. It's an attempt to measure cost, but that exact cost measure is left rather vague. And being an accountant sort of myself, I found that aspect to be particularly interesting, and that's sort of where I'm going to come in with this work. So what we're going to focus on is really just one slice here, namely fossil fuel power plants. As you're aware, for the US, they account for more than 40% of all emissions if you take coal and natural gas plants combined. And the question then that really I was addressing with a student, Oscar Islegen, and the article just came out earlier this year, is, okay, so now let's imagine that CO2 emissions are being priced. What is this going to do in terms of the behavior of these players? In particular, at what point are they going to make the type of technological investments that will reduce their emissions? So they're responding to prices, to price regulation, not to direct regulation. And we're really looking at their incentives to do so, okay? And what we're going to focus on is the possibility of carbon capture and storage. I understand you will hear later on this morning a talk on the science aspect of this. I'm really not in a particularly good position to talk about that other than to sort of show you here the next slide. Technical feasibility, as I understand it, has been broadly established on a sort of demonstration pilot scale, but commercial implementation or implementation on a commercial scale is still to be demonstrated. And there's a lot of work underway some of it government-sponsored, some of it by private companies. There were also some disappointing news recently that some companies have sort of shelved their efforts in this area because they feel the federal government is not providing really the impetus, the regulatory impetus, to go on with these measures further. Okay? It is safe to say, from what I've read at least, that sort of the type of CCS capabilities that we're talking about here, that we're studying, are probably not going to be available until the second half of this decade, if they will be available then. But it's so very much sort of forward-looking for the next generation of power plants to be built. If that technology, indeed, we're going to sort of take the perspective, if that were available, what would that, when would it be implemented, and what would that in turn do to prices? So here, in particular, the two questions that we want to ask: how far would the effective carbon tax under a cap-and-trade system have to go in order for the operators of these power plants to have an incentive to invest in CCS capabilities for newly constructed plants? So this is not retrofitting of existing plants, forward-looking for new plants, assuming this technology really is available to choose. And from an economist perspective, the important thing when we're talking about incentives, of course, is market structure. So in the United States, there are some regions where power generation is organized pretty much competitively. So different power producers basically submit their bids and output to utilities, and that market is organized competitively. But that's not universally true, neither in the US nor in other countries of the world. The alternative is still sort of the traditional vertically integrated utility, where prices are based on cost. And the pricing is basically done so as to ensure that the regulated firm gets a targeted return on its investment. That's a very different model in terms of incentives. And I want to sort of distinguish these two structures as I'm going through the talk. So then the corresponding second question, the immediate question that follows that is, if you have an answer to one, if you do indeed assume that CCS will become operational on a commercial scale, by how much and at what rate will electricity prices rise over time for alternative values of the carbon tax? Okay. So one concept that, in particular for the competitive power scenario, is absolutely crucial is one that's in the literature called the levelized cost of electricity. Think of this, I provided you with a verbal definition from the MIT 2007 study on the future of coal. You can read for yourself what's in italics there. It's basically a life cycle cost of the output, electricity, when seen over the whole time span of the investment, the plant that we're investing in. And what you're averaging out is the initial capital cost and the ongoing operating cost. And you're basically putting that into a single unit cost number. That's sort of what you would have to be able to charge for electricity, so that investors in this plant, also the creditors, and ultimately also the government through taxes, would all get paid off. So this is sort of a break-even type cost. The reason that this is important for the discussion in this paper and this work is you can interpret really the LCOE, the levelized cost of electricity, as a long-run marginal cost, which in a competitive market, you should expect price to be equal to that long-run marginal cost. I'll try to avoid doing that again. So that's sort of the standard, if you want to, for the competitive scenario. So in terms of alternatives that we're looking at, a traditional pulverized coal plant, the alternative, an IGCC, integrated gasification combined cycle plant, with or without carbon capture possibilities, and also a natural gas combined cycle. Again, that one too, in principle, with or without the capability to capture carbon emissions. So here's the first result. Basically, what we're finding is, in this competitive scenario, if the carbon tax, the effective carbon tax under a cap-and-trade system, would rise as far as $31 per ton, then the operators of coal-fired power plants would have an incentive to make that type of investment. And again, the criterion is in a competitive market, they would be faced with the task of producing at a cost that is as low as possible, so the levelized cost of electricity is as low as possible. And by that criterion, you would be willing to make that additional investment, also incur the higher operating cost. That's going to be cheaper for you than to pay the emission charge in terms that basically would come out of a cap and trade system. So you see there is at 31, there's basically a cutoff level. Up to that point, your cost and market prices for electricity would rise relatively rapidly because a coal-fired power plant is pretty dirty, so you have sort of full exposure to the charges. Thereafter, once you make that investment, things rise at a much, much smaller rate, only in the initial 1.68% as opposed to 0.19%. So let me put this sort of together a little bit here in terms of what this finding says. $31 as the break-even point. At that break-even point, two things happen. The pulverized coal plant becomes cost ineffective, and operators would be, if they're sticking with coal, would be switching to the integrated, the IGCC technology with CCS capabilities. The wholesale price of electricity, that is the levelized cost of electricity, would at that point go up by about 50%. But remember, that's only wholesale prices, not retail prices. So that would roughly translate into a retail price increase to the tune of 28%. So in that sense, from that perspective, really, this is a statement that as long as the CCS technology really does become available, fears of doubling electricity prices are sort of widely overblown from that perspective. Okay? The other thing is beyond the break-even point of $30 per ton of CO2, you have basically insurance for these types of guys because they would be reducing their emissions by about 85 to 90%. The exposure that they would have from here on to higher carbon prices would be very minimal. So that was the part about going up by only 0.19% for every additional dollar in the carbon tax thereafter. I've portrayed all of this as sort of a world of complete certainty. We're just sort of going through different prices and so asking when are they going to switch. Again, because of this aspect of being shielded from effective effects, if there is uncertainty and firms are risk averse, and most of them are, the argument is even stronger in this situation that as long as the expected carbon tax is $31, you would be willing to make this type of investment. Okay? What happens with natural gas? Same type of story you can ask. But what we find there is that the break-even point is much, much higher. So you would have to basically have a carbon tax that's to the tune of $60 rather than $30 before that investment would become valuable. And the reasons are really twofold. One is, in the first place, of course, gas-fired plants emit only about half the CO2 that coal-fired power plants emit. But the second argument is in terms of the incremental plant construction cost associated with these things. It is far substantially higher for natural gas plants. So the increment drives sort of the incentive to make that adoption, and that really pushes it out. One of the things that I can't sort of quite talk about here for time reasons is it also now brings out an interesting sort of comparison of the competitiveness of coal versus natural gas. And basically, for very low carbon taxes, coal wins. But there is a range for in about $25 to $50 where natural gas wins without the adoption of these types of capabilities. And of course, then if the carbon tax goes really high, both of them will adopt, and then coal becomes, again, more competitive. So that you get sort of a very pattern in terms of which of these technologies is ultimately more cost competitive. Okay. With an eye on time, the other alternative in all of this is, as I mentioned, that electricity generation is not organized competitively, but according to this rate of return constraint. So this would mean roughly that prices in each period, electricity prices that regulators will approve, are set so that a rate of return constraint, which looks at the income of these firms relative to the asset values that they have, that is set so as to not exceed a targeted rate of return that, again, a regulatory commission sets. So that's a very different form of pricing. And when we started this, we had sort of no idea how this would come out relative to the competitive scenario. Certain things actually come out the same, others very differently. So let me do this in the remaining 3 minutes. One question, of course, you also have to ask is, when will a regulated firm be allowed to make that type of investment? So the assumption we make here is really that regulators look at this from a consumer welfare perspective and say, well, if the carbon tax, for a given carbon tax, you're allowed to make that type of investment if the discounted future consumer surpluses, that is sort of that stream of consumer surpluses in the future, is higher under alternative A versus alternative B. In that case, you're allowed to make the investment. Okay. So here is, now this becomes sort of harder to do in closed form. So this becomes sort of a massive computational exercise. Let me sort of tell you here the results for at least the coal-fired power plants. Interestingly enough, you still get a cutoff level of about $30 per ton. So then even the regulated firm would want to make this type of investment. But what you now want to track is not only here in the columns the emission charges for CO2, but also you want to track this in real time, because what happens is, as the firm makes this investment, its cost base now is a combination of older, dirtier plants and newer plants that you have brought on through the investment. And in your cost base, you're averaging these two types of technologies. So the interesting thing is, if you look at this, here is sort of our cutoff level at about $30 per ton. And if you track this over time, it takes really quite a bit, about 30 years, for the impact of the CO2 emissions really to be felt in terms of reaching their sort of plateau level. So roughly, once again, consistent with what we had before, wholesale electricity prices, not retail, wholesale would go up by about 45% after about 30 years, but then they're leveling off there too. Up to that point, the increases are going to be much, much lower. Why? Because, again, the cost-based nature of the pricing ensures that older plants, at least if they're being grandfathered under the regulations, are part of that cost base. So if, you're now talking sort of to a policymaker on this, what is this going to do to electricity prices? To the extent that we have historical cost as the basis of our prices, it's actually going to take quite a bit of time for prices to reflect the cost of this new technology. Basically, it's sort of the last generation paid for things already, and in that sense, we have a shield here. Okay, I'm being told 1 minute. You can hopefully, the purpose of this talk is to give you an idea. There is lots to be done here. I felt I sort of walked into this because I was sort of frustrated with the range of cost estimates, sloppy cost estimates as far as I could see in this area. But I feel we have sort of just gone down the most simple path in these comparisons. There's a lot of work to be done in this area. I had a lot of fun walking into this, and I think the opportunities are very rich in this. Conclusion that we draw on a preliminary basis here, fears of doubling electricity prices are widely overblown, at least as long as this technology becomes available. Gas and coal are going to behave very differently. As far as the market structure is concerned, it doesn't make that much of a difference in terms of the cutoff level, but it does make a difference in terms of how quickly the impact of the carbon taxes would be felt in the electricity prices. And with that, I'll stop. I guess I'll turn it to the moderator.
Can you please go back to the slide for LCOE?
Yes.
I was actually just curious, what is the
This one here?
Yeah. What is the acceptable return to investors? What kind of margins are they looking at? Will they compare it to 10, 20 years ago and compare it to now? Has there been any difference in the margins that they're looking in power plants?
Yeah. Basically, in much of this, we're sort of not within the study itself or within, I would say, sort of, let me put it like this. The required rate of return is sort of usually seen as a variable that's derived from broader capital asset pricing type models, and it's not being derived in this. You can tailor it a little bit to the specifics of the industry, and you would also tailor it a little bit to the notion, is this a regulated firm? So for regulated firms, you would typically expect this required rate of return to be lower than sort of in the competitive market. The one good thing is, I mean, we always, even though we talk a lot about the cost of capital, there's always a certain uneasiness in satisfying it. If you do sensitivity type studies, the results are not particularly sensitive. So if you say the required rate of return, say for equity holders, is anywhere between 8 and 12%, the numbers don't move much if I vary the cost of capital in that range. Yeah. Oh, you should be doing this. No.
How do you address the concern that a lot of people say that the carbon tax is more of a regressive tax since energy costs represent a higher percentage of poor people's income than rich people's income?
Yeah. So have not done this. I mean, in particular, sort of in the regulation scenario, when we talk about in the competitive scenario, there's almost sort of no room to address the point that you're mentioning. In the competitive scenario, there might be potentially. What we're doing at the moment is we're really looking at consumer surplus, but there's no attempt to differentiate or put different weights on consumers with higher or lower income. But that might be a way to do this, that you sort of split basically this whole thing into two consumer groups and try to keep track of that separately. If you had more concern, if you had the type of concern that you just mentioned. In the competitive scenario, I don't think you could do it. The market just forces you to choose the low-cost technology.
So if we assume the revenue from a carbon tax is returned to the consumer, have you done studies on how much the consumer effectively has to pay extra in order to have this carbon tax, especially as companies adopt carbon capture and storage?
Mm-hmm. I mean, good point. Ultimately, there is a link in terms of consumers' willingness to pay their income. The current study has sort of abstracted from this altogether. So consumers' willingness to pay for electricity is not tied to the overall level of taxation that they're subject to. And that would be another way to sort of expand this. In fact, this study is also relatively silent in terms of, other than the grandfathering stuff that I showed you in the regulation scenario, it's relatively silent on do all firms sort of have to buy emission permits, or are they being allocated some initially? Once again, in the competitive scenario, it wouldn't make a difference. In the regulation scenario, it does make a difference in terms of what endowment do firms initially have in terms of these. And then the link that you're mentioning is that demand for electricity itself is also a function of the taxes that are being imposed. That's sort of, in my mind, sort of a higher order argument. And no, our model is too simple to handle that. But all the power to you in trying to do this.
In a competitive market, so you're saying in a regulated market or in a regulated structure, it would phase in over time. But in a competitive market, how would it play out? Would it just be the next overnight, basically, the real-time bids would just increase by 30%, or some amount?
Yes, that's a really good question that we've sort of spent a lot of time on. The key question is, how far in advance are the players in this market aware of the regulation coming? and then sort of the whole effect of being locked into particular technologies. So the scenario is really one where you would say this regulation goes into effect 10 years from now, or 5 years from now, and we're anticipating it today. Then you would actually have prices be responsive even before that regulation goes into effect. The exact sort of real-time modeling depends crucially on when are the players aware that this regulation or the carbon tax is coming their way. But that's a really good point, and once again, one that we're sort of glossing over. These are sort of steady state projections, but how that adjustment goes in real time depends on the information that the parties have.
Time for one more question. If anybody has a question.
So, assuming that the IGCC and NGCC are in competition with wind and solar power generation, if you put a price on carbon emissions, does that also affect the competitiveness of like wind electricity and to the point that maybe NGCC or IGCC will not lose competition against?
Yes. And this is sort of a whole bunch of exercises that I sort of consider now the next generation. I have only played this game, gas versus coal, and what if the universe of electricity generation came sort of from these two sources. From a policy perspective, the interesting thing is now take renewables and put those in comparison. What you find here is, because of the shielding aspect, if CCS technology really is viable and does get used at a certain point, the answer would be, once you go beyond, say, the $30 carbon tax, you're not shifting much anymore the relative competitiveness of those two sources. But up to the $30 charge, you, of course, the carbon tax does make, as you would expect, does make the renewables more competitive. But that's sort of now a set of calculations and modeling all in its own to go really renewables versus fossil fuels. And how effective is a carbon tax versus other type of incentives? I mean, what we're seeing, of course, currently is the administration going much more in the direction, rather than taxing fossil fuels, subsidizing renewables. But you can play that game. Which of these policy instruments would be more effective? Again, lots to do. To my mind, I don't think this has been done comprehensively at all so far.